So we're looking, of course, in 2 Peter. We've gotten to another section of the text of 2 Peter. And, of course, Peter is talking about, the people who've led people astray, although in the context of this particular verse, he may very well be talking not only about them, but also about the people that they lead astray. Because if we take a look back, and I need to actually open up the scripture here because I don't want to go back all the slides that it would take to get back to this point. But if we take a look at 2 Peter chapter 2, a little bit before this passage, what he says is, let's see. Yeah, okay. He says, these are springs without water. Now this is definitely talking about the false teachers. These are springs without water and mists driven by the storm, for whom the black darkness has been reserved. For speaking out arrogant words of vanity, they entice by fleshly desires, by sensuality, those who barely escape from the ones who live in error, promising them freedom while they themselves are slaves of corruption. For by what a man is overcome, by this he is enslaved. So it kind of sounds like as he begins this new sentence, it's still part of the same paragraph, although that's actually an artificial creation of English or of the modern languages on top of Hebrew, which doesn't have, or Greek, which doesn't really have that. It certainly sounds like when he says, for if after they have escaped the defilements of the world by the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, that he could very well be talking about not just those who are the false teachers, but also those who they then lead astray with their false teachings, because both would qualify under this category, because he's indicated before that the false teachers were at one time Christians who had, who were following Christian and godly principles. And then he's talking about those that are led astray by them as well. And the point of this is that those who have known Jesus Christ, and they've had that escape from the world, they have actually been saved. If they then are again entangled by those defilements of the world, and they are overcome by those defilements, the last state has become worse for them than the first. Now, this to me is one of the most clear statements we have in the scriptures that destroys the whole concept of this once saved, always saved argument. Because no matter what argument you hear from someone who's doing the once saved, always saved, it always amounts to, it may look like they're lost, but they're not really lost. But Peter says the last state is not just similar to the first, not just a lot like the first, only not as bad. He says it's actually worse than it would have been if they hadn't known better. In fact, he goes on to say exactly that. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than having known it, to turn away from the holy commandment handed on to them. It has happened to them according to a true proverb, a dog returns to its own vomit, and a sow after washing, different meaning of the word sow, a sow after washing returns to wallowing in the mire. So we have this idea that those who know Jesus and then turn away from them are worse off than they would have been had they simply not known him at all. So let's take a look at some of the passages that kind of helps us with this. So when we look at this idea of the last state for them has become worse for them than the first, in 2 John he says, for many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in flesh. John is also dealing with the Gnostics. This is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Watch yourselves that you do not lose what we have accomplished, but that you may receive a full reward. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. The one who abides in the teaching, he has both the Father and the Son. So John says, you got to be careful that you don't go too far, which is an interesting concept when we talk about a God who wants us to surrender everything to him. It's like, well, did I surrender too much to you? But when he talks about going too far, what does he mean? What is John referring to in that context?
I think he's probably talking about your own thoughts, your own interpretations, your own application of what's being said.
Okay. Paul elsewhere will talk about if somebody teaches or preaches a gospel other than the one that we have preached. A gospel, a message of, that would seem to be from God and would seem to be contain principles of godliness, isn't necessarily a gospel that is the gospel approved by God. And so going too far isn't somebody who's saying, in this context, isn't somebody who's saying, I reject God, or I don't want any part of this. It's somebody who's basically building their own religion. Mark?
I was going to say, it's the freedom. We have a lot of freedom in Christ now, compared to what they had before. But it's the same thing. If you go too far with that freedom, it's just that once saved, always saved mentality. Now you say, okay, the freedom is there. I can do anything I want because I'm saved.
Yeah.
And so here it is again, building that same thing, going too far, getting onto your own path instead of what Christ actually taught you.
Romans 6:1. The idea of should I sin just because of human grace?
Okay. Yeah. So, and I think this is where we start to really see this idea of that narrow path. Because going too far can mean going too far in terms of liberality and saying I can do whatever I want to, or going too far in the sense of constructing rules and you know, some kind of limitations that aren't supposed to be there. The Pharisees went too far in taking the law and saying, okay, we got the law, and here's all the rules and regulations and commandments and everything else that we have to follow. You have to follow, or you're not going to be good people. Whereas the situation with the Corinthians was they went too far in the sense of, you know, everything's okay, whatever, you know, it's fine with us, you know, it'd be great, we're so loving, we must be better than all the other churches because we're so loving, you know. And either way, you've gone too far in either direction because, well, you're claiming to be a Christian, you're claiming to be a church that follows God. What you're really doing is setting up structures that give you the permission to do what you want to do.
Here's an illustration of Mark's comment about the freedom. You know, Christ, remember, he said, you know, wide is the path to destruction, narrow is the path to salvation. Even a pencil line, when you think about it, has some width, and you know, I think this recognizes that the freedom that we have is there. The narrow path even has a little width. That we have the freedom within that. That we could go too far one way, but we may also be able to go too far the other way and become too legalistic in our application.
Yeah. But you can go some distance, because otherwise there wouldn't be the two in there, right?
Yeah.
You know, so there is room for a certain degree of flexibility, and to say that there isn't is itself creating a, you know, going too far in one direction. So.
I think this is also a warning. So I don't disagree with what anyone has said, but I think this is also a warning for those who want to do more intellectual type of debates where we don't lose what the focus is. What are salvation issues versus arguments that we like to have and things we want to trip over. I remember we were held up on a publication because we couldn't decide if it should be envelop or enveloped. We were held up on a D, okay? And aesthetically pleasing sounding sentence versus actually correct, and you stumble over it. Like, this was a fight for a full week until somebody was like, well, don't we just want to get the information published? And I was like, oh yeah. So we lost sight over that, and heated debates that didn't need to be had over if you should include a D or not on that word, right? Like, we totally lost sight of what we were doing for a word. Right?
A letter, really.
A letter, right? So even though we want to have some very intellectual debates and not saying that they're not warranted, but is it salvation issues? And if you want to go too far into that area, sometimes we lose our focus.
So there's a danger of intellectualism that isn't necessarily associated with either of those two sides, where you become, it's not so, you're just losing track of where you're supposed to be going. You're just wandering off on your own kind. Steve?
So verse 9 to me sort of answers the question of what too far is, and that is to no longer abide in the teachings of Christ. And if we get to the point where we're no longer abiding in the teachings of Christ, we don't have God, and we've gone too far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
one thing about John is he's very absolute in a lot of his phrases. If you say you don't have sin, the truth's not in you. You know, he doesn't mess around. You know, if you say you have not sinned, God isn't in you. There's just you got nothing. You know, he doesn't really leave you a lot of gray area with some things like that. You know, but yeah, we have the ability to have some flexibility and some, you know, this is something we want to do and that's fine. This is something different that somebody else wants to do and that's fine. We have room for that within what Christ is, the teachings of Christ. When we start trying to impose our rules and say these are Christ's rules, that's when we run into problems.
This sounds like a series of 8 or 10 weeks on the Sunday morning Bible class.
Well, not right now. It's not a series of 8 or 10 weeks. That would be an interesting conversation down the road, but not right now. We just want to sort of brush against this briefly here before we get too far down this path of what constitutes going too far. But I think it's interesting to think about, in a general sense, to think about two Christian denominations, or really it's more than that, two different Christian ways of thinking. And they're illustrated by, on the one side of it, you have the Calvinists who have created the doctrines of well, not entirely created it, but certainly they adhere to the doctrines of once saved, always saved, an irresistible call, and basically that there are elect, and if you're chosen, you're in, and if you're not chosen, you aren't. And they create all these different doctrines. And on the one hand, there's a lot of strictness that goes along with that, but on the other hand, underlying that, especially in neo-Calvinism, is that sense of, look, it just happens to me because it happens to me. It's not my fault, really. I'm just doing what I've been called to do, you know, and if Jesus has called me, then I'm saved, and if he didn't call me, then I'm not saved, and there's nothing I can do about it. So that's, you know, and on that side, you have someone who has the trappings of godliness, or the trappings of Christianity, because they're saying, you know, I want to do what God wants, and I believe in God, and I believe in the power of God in my life, but ultimately they're defining their lives in a way and using a doctrine that ultimately removes all responsibility from themselves, and thus gives them freedom to do whatever they want to. And that's going too far in one direction. On the other side of it, we have Catholicism, which creates more and more complicated rules and procedures and all of that, and has been doing it for a very long time, so they've gotten very good at it, but it still is a matter of creating a whole bunch of new rules and regulations and, you know, structures and everything else, and defines themselves as being, the word Catholic literally means correct or true. If I'm correct about that, that would be ironic if I wasn't. But
Ian will be able to look it up.
So in any event, we have this notion either way where you know, I don't know that there's anybody who would ever argue that the Pope is not a religious man, you know, that he doesn't believe in what he's saying. I mean, there certainly historically have been some popes who I don't think did, but I think the Pope believes in what he's saying, and I think most of the people who lead the Catholic Church in some way or another believe in what they're saying. Certainly they believe in the institution. And there is a trapping of righteousness or a trapping of godliness that goes along with that. But at the end of the day, if you're making up your own rules and your rules supersede God's rules, you have a problem. You've gone too far down that road. And so either way we want to look at it, it's easy, even when you appear to be on a godly path, to veer off into something that takes you away from that. And then you add into that our tendency these days to add all sorts of, you know, humanistic spiritualism to our understanding. So it's, you know, that God is in you, or, you know, the universe is, we're all part of the universe, and we're all part of the, you know, whatever it is, the collective consciousness or whatever. And suddenly you undermine the notion of some kind of actual clear expectation, some clear actual teachings of Christ, by making it seem like it's all part of just this sort of panoply of different things you can believe in. And so we have to be mindful that our job is to identify the teachings of Christ and to follow them, and not to try to create rules where they don't exist, and not to try to find excuses to avoid the expectations and the principles that do exist. And that's not always easy. That's why it could easily be an 8 to 10 or 30 or 40 week class if we started talking about what it means to try to find the things that fall within the category of things that are opinion versus things that are established doctrinal, expectations. So it's complicated. But the problem we have here is that, or the risk we have, and that we cannot hide from, is that we do have to be careful as Christians, because being a Christian is not a matter of a one-time deal. You got baptized, you're saved, it's all good. Maybe if you check in once or twice a year with the church and, Easter and Christmas, you're good to go. That's not the principle that we see in the Scriptures. The principle in the Scriptures are people who live Jesus' life, or the life of the Christian, every day, and people who are mindful of the fact that they need to keep on that narrow path and not just wander around wherever they want to go. Jesus talks about this, and this is the idea we see where Peter says it would be better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than to have known it and fallen away. And Jesus talks about this. He speaks of, I guess, a parable, or at least an analogy that we see. He says, that slave who knew his master's will and did not get ready or act in accordance with the will receive many lashes. But the one who did not know it and committed deeds worthy of a flogging will receive but few. From everyone who's been given much, much will be required, and to whom they entrusted much, of him they will ask all the more. So, Jesus talks about this idea, and this is one of the things that always gives us a hard time, a difficult time with this, because traditionally we have taught about hell as being an unending series of punishments that, just go on for all of eternity. And from that perspective, we have trouble distinguishing how, you can have fewer lashes when it's eternal, At the point that you think, well, I didn't get as many as that guy, you got to remember it's still going to go on forever, So there's not, we struggle with this, with understanding this, and some people have articulated the idea that maybe what it's talking about is that if you knew Jesus and then you lost that, then it's a greater suffering because you knew what you could have had and now you don't have it. I don't know if that's true. I've seen a lot of pictures of dogs that have been beaten for their entire life, and they didn't look like they, were unaware of the fact that things were kind of terrible. Like a dog that had been treated well and got beat later on might have perceived that. So I don't think that, I'm more inclined to believe in a more nuanced understanding of the afterlife, which is not what we want to get into right now. But I know Jerry and I know Betty's not here, but I've been reading this book that I loaned you about the afterlife that's written by F. LaGard Smith. It talks about some alternative perspectives on what the end of time is and what the consequences for sin are, in the sense of the finality of the judgment that's taking place. But again, the critical point here for us isn't to try to figure out exactly what the actual punishment for sin is going to be or what the outcome is going to be in eternity. The critical point for us to understand is we don't want to be on that side of the judgment, whether it's because we didn't know or because we knew and fell away. That's not where we want to be. We want to be, and we want to stay on the side that we're on, which is we know, and we're living in a way that honors what we know. And then we don't have to worry about it. You don't have to try to figure, is eternity forever, or are some people going to be punished for a while and they're going to be just destroyed, or what? We don't have to worry about that. That's not our problem. Our problem, our concern is to make sure that we are on the right side of this. And so the critical point here is that, again, that you can fall away. You can lose what you had because you're disobedient. And so we need to be mindful of the expectations for us, and we need to be following Jesus' expectations for us. So Jesus continues, and we're continuing, he says, it would be, sorry, not Jesus. Paul continues, or Peter has, because he said it would be better for them not to have known the way of righteousness. Paul in Galatians says, brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. So Paul says it's a very good thing to bring somebody back from the brink or from the other side, to get them back who has been caught in a trespass, somebody who's gotten off path. James says something very similar. If any among you strays from the truth and one turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins. So here again, this is somebody who's strayed from the truth, and their soul is apparently facing death, because that's what James says you're turning them back from. So there's kind of 2 points here I want to make. Number one is that it's important to recognize, we see this reinforced over and over again, that you can in fact lose your salvation. I don't want to be necessarily negative here today, this is where we're at. But there's also an important point here, which is that if you stray, you can come back again. This is not one of those things where you get in, and once you're kicked out, they won't ever let you back in again. You know, there are some organizations like that. Once you join and get kicked out, you don't ever get to come back, no matter what you do or how you do it, you're done. And so in the case of Christianity, that's not the situation. We have the ability to be restored. We have the ability to turn back and get back onto the path, and the forgiveness that Jesus offers us continues to cleanse us. And I mention this because as odd as this might seem, I am actually aware of some people in the church who teach that this is not possible. That if you are a Christian and you commit certain kinds of particularly serious sins, you can never be restored again. And this creates an interesting dynamic, because they had 2 sons, and one of their sons still hasn't gotten baptized, because his feeling is that if he gets baptized, then if he messes up real bad, he's out. As long as he isn't baptized, there's always the possibility he can choose to, join up later and not blow it, So, and his father is constantly, I don't understand why that boy won't be baptized. Well, I have a theory, and I've talked to him about that, and he doesn't, it's not anyone at the church here, just to be clear. I talked to him about that, and I've tried to explain it to him, but the problem is that the father believes that the doctrine lines up with this. Now, he was taught by a very, very conservative preacher, and he adopted a lot of very conservative doctrines, and this is one of the ones that he got. And there is just nothing in the scriptures to support that idea. Steve?
Well, I think especially the one about blaspheming the Holy Spirit is the one that most people may misunderstand.
Right.
What that is.
And that's a conversation for itself. And of course, we don't have an entirely clear understanding of what that is, although we've got some different speculation. But in his case, he defines those things as things like adultery, murder. Really, it's more defined by what I would think of as like class 1 felonies than actually. Adultery is not a class 1 felony, obviously, but those kinds of things are more in his list than anything about the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. And so when we define things that way, we can expect to sort of keep people on the outside looking in, because who wants to be part of something where there is a chance for you to be saved, but if you blow it, you can never get it back again.
Well, divorce and remarriage is another one where a number of brethren feel that that's a permanent sinful condition.
Yeah.
That if you don't get out of it, that you're lost definitely.
Right, and I'm familiar with that, and unfortunately, and that's again beyond the scope of what we want to go into in detail today, but the problem with that, of course, is if there is something, that this blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, if that actually refers to a specific sin, it seems like if divorce and remarriage was the specific sin, they could have just called it that, And given that that's the only sin that's ever referenced as being something you can't come back from, then divorce and remarriage would not seem to be that case. And we don't ever see in the scriptures anybody ever saying to someone who was remarried, you got to divorce that person and you've got to go back to the first person, or you've got to live, separated.
I have.
What's that?
I have.
No, somebody in the scriptures.
Oh, not in the scriptures.
I'm not talking about somebody in the church. I definitely am familiar with people in the church who said that. But if you look in the scriptures, Jesus encounters the situation with the woman at the well. And he doesn't say to her, you got to leave your current partner and go back to the first one or something. He does say, in fact, he doesn't even talk to her about any of that. He's more talking about water and spreading this idea of the gospel or of the kingdom of God to her. But similarly, when Jesus is approached by the Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law, we're talking about the situation where the woman who was married and her husband's kept dying, which at some point you'd think that the authorities would want to look into that. But her husband's kept dying, and they ask him the question, whose husband is she? Or who's her husband? Whose wife is she? Jesus' answer is, well, there's really no divorce and remarriage. There's no marriage in the resurrection, so we don't worry about that. You know, the fact that I think that on the one side it's very clear that God values marriage enormously. On the other side, it's very clear that the conditions that we operate under in this human life, in many ways, go away at the end of time. The choices that we've made impact us, but the you know, whether it's, you know, being old and infirm, or whether it's being, having the struggling with sin, the different things that we deal with, those things go away in the recreation and in the new creation that we're going to be. So I think this notion that remarriage is a permanent sin unless you get out of it is a very problematic one, but that, again, a much more detailed discussion.
Another verse that would go up here with the same idea is pretty straightforward, Hebrews 12:15. Look diligently lest anyone fall short of the grace of God.
Okay.
And that very fall short of the grace of God.
There's several places the Hebrew writer talks about this, of, you know, not messing it up just short of the goal line. You know, whether it's when he talks about, you know, the cloud of witnesses and running the race and finishing the race. The Hebrew writer is very concerned with persistence and endurance and that kind of stuff. And this idea that if you stop before the race is over, you don't win anything. You know, you can run almost the entire marathon, but if you veer off near the end and go get a drink or something, I don't mean like a drink of water. You go sit down in a pub and just, you know, hang out. You didn't finish the race. And it doesn't matter how much of it you did finish, you didn't finish the race, and you don't want to have that happen. So. Okay, so it's important for us to understand, number one, that yes, it is possible to fall away, and that's a very bad thing to have happen to us. And number two, that it is also possible for us to be restored to a condition of righteousness, even after that has happened, because the grace of God is not limited to the first time we messed up. Even David messed up twice on a big scale, you know, and still was remembered as the greatest of Israel's kings. Okay, so moving on. This is an interesting one, where he says, a dog returns to its own vomit, a sow after washing returns to wallowing in the mire. This idea of going back to something that's bad for you. It's interesting to me that Jesus in Matthew chapter 7 says, do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, or they will trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. It's an interesting concept, because Jesus appears to be saying that there are some people that you really shouldn't waste your effort on. Is that true? Are there really some people that we shouldn't really expend our effort on?
I think he's really referring to the historical situation he's in with Israel as being the dogs and the swine.
That's not an interpretation that the Pharisees would have liked very much, but certainly a possibility, I think, yes. I'm going to open up to that chapter there, because it's kind of an interesting context. It helps to understand context. So, so he's talking, and this is in the Sermon on the Mount, he's talking about a variety of things. He's talked about do not judge just before that. Then he talks about giving to dogs, not giving holy things to dogs, not throwing your pearls before swine. Then he transitions over to ask and it will be given to you. So it seems like this is kind of out of nowhere. Just, hey, guess what? You know? And on the one hand, if this were a traditional rabbi's discourse, this might be viewed as less of a religious discourse than just a pragmatism kind of a discourse, because it was not uncommon for rabbis to give advice on pragmatism along with religion. You know, here's the smart thing to do when you marry a girl, you know, or here's, you know, how you take care of your money or whatever it is. And so on one level, it kind of seems like it could have that element to it. But, I mean, number one, you'd like to think that the Jews already understood that. Don't give what's holy to dogs, don't throw your pearls before swine, obviously. So what he's talking about here has a deeper meaning than just, you know, don't waste your valuable possessions or things that are important. What he's talking about here seems to suggest that there are some people who, because of the way they behave or because of their mindset, are not really candidates for the gospel. Not in the sense that the gospel can't save anyone, but in the sense that they're simply not interested in hearing and willing to follow it.
Well, in Matthew 10, just a few chapters down, verse 14 says, if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town.
Okay.
So he's kind of reaffirming.
And I think that gets us to an important difference then between those that we maybe keep working to try to get to the truth and those that we say, you know what, not right now. What's the difference?
The recipient's attitude.
Okay, how so?
Well, you can usually tell, talking to someone, how they feel about religion as a whole. And you take that input and you may make a comment or two, but if it's reinforced that they just don't believe in God, or they believe in their own religion, or their own understanding of religion or idols or whatever, they're not going to be receptive. Maybe it's a judgment call.
Okay. Sue.
Well, there's an interesting line here because you're trying also to bring people into the fold. So maybe you have to back off and you're talking a little and set more examples. But at the same time, I don't know if you totally give up on them. You just might change your route.
Okay.
It reminds me of the seeds on different soil.
Okay.
This here, and it's in both of these. Not once is it told to change the nature of the creature. It's told to watch your value. And so, yes, with what Sue's saying, we don't give up who we are, but maybe our tactics need to change, and maybe our expectations for other people need to change, because they can only progress so far given when they came in, history, those types of things.
Okay.
They might be on milk for the rest of their lives.
That's another issue there. Yeah, that's okay. Jerry?
There's another place where Christ talks about the wife with the unbelieving husband,
Mm-hmm.
and how long that you may someday be able to save that man.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it may not be, today they may want to ignore you, but maybe in the future they won't. That seems to be in there. Maybe we're not supposed to give up trying. Recognize that they're probably not going to be receptive, but at least recognize by your example and maybe comments that you are still interested. I don't know if that's
Well, we're kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Brainstorming here in a certain respect. Mark.
You know, doing what I did for years, you see how low people can go. There are some times when you just got to back off. They're wallowing in sin. That's their life. And there are times when we could reach that person when they want to be reached, or they have a problem or a death, or there's times when we may be able to reach that person. And I think maybe that's what it is. They're wallowing in it. It might be, it's not the right time to come and say,
Right.
hey, they don't want to listen at that time. But there are times in their life that you do have a chance and you have that opportunity, but it's that, you know, we struggle with this because you see people out there you would love to reach out to, but you can't. Their personality and at that time, they don't want to have nothing to do with God.
Yeah.
And so what do? We struggle with that inside. I struggle with it. I want to help you, but right now I can't help you because you're killing yourselves.
Right.
And you don't have that life. But just so they know, hey, I have an answer for you whenever you're ready. If you can get at least that part, they hear it, then maybe you got a shot at them later.
Yeah.
But, that, you know, that's why, you know, narrow is the way. I mean, do you give up? what makes you happy continuously, you know what I mean, in this world,
Right.
to look for a better thing. And there's some people that just will not.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think when we look at and we think about people in the world, we think about them, we can view them kind of in categories. And there are people who are lost and who have a sense of loss that are looking for something. And those are the easiest people to reach when we bring the gospel up, because they are looking for something, and when you show them that something, they go, oh, that's what I'm looking for. And when you look at a lot of the people that Paul converted in his early missionary journeys, there were people like that, people whose hearts were turned towards God, either because they were Jews who'd been open to that, or they were Gentiles who'd been seeing Jews and knowing that there was something better than the things that they were believing in and the pagan lives that they were living. And so Paul says, here it is, and they're like, all right, this is what I've been waiting for, you know? And there are still people like that. They're hard to find in this country. But boy, you send missionaries to other places and they find them all over the place, because we have such a good life here that we forget that there's things that we need that don't necessarily entail the wealth and values of this life. You go over to Africa, you go over to Eastern Europe, you go to places where there's poverty, where there's hardship, and you say there is something better down the road, there is something to fill in that void that you feel right now. There's lots of people who are like, I've been looking for that, you know? So there's that group, and that's the group that is easy to say, these are the ones we need to be, you know, spreading the gospel to, because they're going to listen. And then there's the group that I think is more like what you're talking about, the ones who are just so caught up in their sin that you can keep pouring effort and attention and everything into them, and they're just going to keep absorb it like a black hole, you know, because they're not in a place where they can really hear you and really meaningfully accept the idea of changing. Not that they might not ever get there, but in the time, you know, there's going to need to be something that's going to move them in some way. They're in what Peter or what Paul describes in Romans, that downward spiral. You know, they're just working their way down the spiral. Things are getting uglier and uglier, but they're not at the bottom yet. And until something creates a bottom for them, they're just going to keep going, and it's going to be really hard to pull them up out of it. But the third group, and I think the third group is the one that really we ought to be the most concerned about and the most aware that these are not the people to waste our energy on, are the ones who are the cynics, or the ones who are the religious, the Pharisaical types, where they either know the truth and have adjusted it to their view, and so they are cynically manipulating the gospel, in which case, I mean, what truth do you have to present them that they don't know already? They know the truth, they're just not interested in it. You know, they're not, again, this isn't somebody who was on the path and stumbled or got caught up in a sin and fell away. This is someone who is cynically manipulating the truth to get what they want, or to, you know, to get them where they want. And people like that are people that we need to stay as far away from as possible when we realize what they are. Because they're the ones who, if you try to earnestly present them the gospel, all they're going to do is undermine your faith. All they're going to do is destroy your expectations. And by associating with them, we run the risk of other people saying, oh, those people have some good ideas too. We don't want anybody to make the mistake of thinking that somebody like that is someone they should listen to. And so we need to stay a long way away from people like that. People who are trampling on the things that we value, you know. And by the same token, we see people in the world who are these, you know, the secular humanists who are sarcastic and condescending, and basically they treat religion as though it's a child's fairy tale, and treat us like children as well. These are not people you're going to reach with the gospel anytime soon. It's going to require something external to hit them that's going to change their way of looking at things. So people like that are people that I think probably most identify with what Jesus is talking about here, the kind of people where we just have to stay away from them. Sure, you try to share the gospel with them, but once you see that they're that kind of a person, as you said, you can kind of leave that calling card. Hey, you know what? If you're interested, if you get interested, I'm always there to talk. I'm always there to help you, you know, think this through or whatever. But other than that, you know, you gotta figure it out on your own to some extent, because they're not going to be productive fruit. The dangerous one with this is where we get people who are playing along with us and we can't identify that they're just messing with us. I can still, how many of you know who Stephen Colbert is? Okay, a few of you do, some of you do not. Stephen Colbert is a late night talk show host who is an extremely liberal, left-wing person. He used to do a show on Comedy Central where he was parodying a right-wing conservative television host. And the thing that's ironically about this is that a lot of conservatives who didn't see that he was being a parody thought he was actually just a really, really hard right-wing conservative host. So my parents, when it was announced that he was going to be coming, he'd been on Comedy Central, he was going to be coming to CBS, my mom said, well, that's wonderful, he's a strong conservative voice. And I said, Mom, I have bad news for you. You've misunderstood, and you have been the butt of the joke all along if you thought that. We don't want you to be paranoid about that, because at the end of the day, people are going to make fun of us, and that's okay. But we also don't want to be wasting a lot of resources on someone who's just messing with us. And we need to be able to see the difference when it becomes clear.
Well, we need to be careful because we can become cynical ourselves.
Yeah.
In that very same regard.
Yeah. Towards people like that, and also essentially towards our own faith if it happens.
Or towards anyone if we
Yeah.
meet enough, if we come into contact with enough of that side of cynical, then we become this side of cynical, and then we're just not.
And we assume everybody's not like that,
Exactly,
you know.
yes.
Nobody's genuine, nobody wants to listen. Yeah. Jerry and then Mark.
Scott Peck, who wrote The Road Less Traveled, also wrote another book that addresses evil. And he says there are people that are absolutely evil in the sense that you're talking about. And he says it's the narcissist who believes totally in themselves. Whatever the subject is, they have the answer. And you're not going to be able to change that person. The psychiatrist isn't even able to address them because they refuse to say they're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Mark?
I want to go back to like what Sarah said. I think it's still our responsibility to sow the seed. And a lot of times
Yes.
that we want something to happen right away because
Right.
we did that. And we get that, oh, I don't understand why you're not becoming a Christian right now. I got
Right.
the truth, I just gave it to you.
I explained it to you,
Yeah.
it's clearly correct. What's
You know?
wrong with you?
Yes, we just have all these soils out there and all these rocks out there, a lot of them are rocky, that it's just not gonna sink in right away.
Well, or it does, and if we're rushing it, what you end up with is the ones that grow up and then they die because they're not really ready for that.
And I think sometimes we take it in like, what did I do wrong? Well, we didn't do anything wrong. We did what we were supposed to do, and that's what Christ wants us to
Right.
do. It's not that, we just expect the perfect soil all the time. Well, he just told us, there's a bunch of different soils out there. And so we have to just say, hey, we did what we were supposed to do. We can't give up, but there's gonna be times that we're gonna fail on people who are not ready. Simple as that. Or they'll never be ready, but know that. And just say, okay, well, I gotta go on to someone else.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest thing, and that's what I think tears us down where we don't want to do it, because, man, I had this person I thought was perfect, and guess what? We are putting ourselves on them, and they're not ready.
Yeah.
And I think, and then we're like, well, I don't want to do this anymore, because, man, it's not working.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest thing for us. We want that instantaneous, now in this world especially,
Yeah.
outcome.
Yeah.
I don't understand. You gotta be a Christian. And it's the hardest thing. It is
Yeah.
hard.
It is. Steve, you
Perhaps,
wrap us up here.
yeah, let's wrap it up here with a comparison. So we don't really argue religion too much. A lot of people really don't like to do that. But what we do like to do is argue political points of view. And so political points of view vary a tremendous amount as well. And so it's really easy for me to not understand why someone could possibly believe and think the way they do. It doesn't make any sense to me that they wouldn't be able to clearly understand the correct and true interpretation of something.
That's right.
And it's the same with religion. So, it's very true. Some people, they're never gonna get it. They're just not, and so you're not gonna convince them. But the Bible also says, don't grow weary.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's the critical thing, is to not let us, as you said, not let it get us down, that does not, and in fairness, even Paul got down. He actually writes, when he wrote to the Corinthians, I believe, he says, I came to you in fear and trembling because of what happened to him in Athens, where he preached this fantastic sermon, and the Athenians like, yeah, come back and talk to us next week, you know? It seemed like he made such good arguments to people who were such logical people. Why didn't they listen? And he goes to Corinth and he basically reevaluates his whole approach and says, this isn't working, you know? And so he definitely got down from that. But what he didn't do is stop. You know, he finds a new way and he keeps right on going. And I think we have to learn that lesson. It's not always going to work. That doesn't mean we stop. And we are going to encounter people who are cynical. We are going to encounter people who absolutely won't listen to us or will put us down or will, you know, knock us down if need be. And we get back up and we move on. We don't keep going back to them and getting knocked down on purpose, but we do keep going and we do keep looking for people. Okay, let's stop. Next week we will pick up with the 3rd chapter of 2 Peter. We're in the home stretch now. All right, so anyway, thank you guys for all of your comments this morning.